Marco DeLuca came home without warning. No one knew he was back. The mansion was silent, the way it had been for 14 months. But then he heard something. A sound coming from somewhere inside. His heart started to pound. By instinct, his hand reached for the gun at his side. Yet it wasn't the sound of danger. He didn't know what it was. He moved toward it, following the noise, both hands trembling. It was coming from the kitchen. He pushed the door open and what he saw made his heart stop. The agonizing 14 months of absolute silence had not been shattered by enemies, but by a scene bathed in late afternoon sunlight. Dust motes danced in the air like tiny stars, and right in the center of that golden glow stood Jane. She was the new maid with tired eyes whom he had barely noticed before, but now, she was spinning in a circle, holding little Mia by the hands. Mia, his youngest triplet, the one who used to hum in her sleep, was throwing her head back, her mouth wide open in a crystal clear, soaring laugh that echoed against the high ceilings. Sitting on the kitchen island, legs swinging with wild abandon, were Lucia and Valentina. Their faces were flushed with color, their dark curls bouncing as they clapped their hands and sang a nursery rhyme, a song their mother used to sing to them before the rival family took her life. Their voices were a little rusty, slipping out of tune, but they were singing. His daughters, his beautiful, broken little girls who had stared at walls like ghosts for 14 agonizing months, were singing. Marco stood frozen in the doorway. The heavy steel of his gun slipping back into its holster as his hands went entirely numb. For 3 glorious, breathless seconds, a wave of relief so violent it felt like a physical blow slammed into his chest. He wanted to fall to his knees on the polished floor. He wanted to run to them, scoop all 3 of them into his arms, bury his face in their hair, and tell them how much Daddy loved them, how sorry he was that he could not save their mother. He took a shaky step forward, his lips parting to speak their names. But before the sound could leave his throat, Mia let go of Jane's hands, stumbled forward on her tiny feet, and wrapped her arms around the maid's knees. "Sing it again, Miss Jane. Sing it again," the little girl pleaded, her voice overflowing with absolute adoration, pure trust, and a desperate, clinging love that Marco had not seen in over a year. The warmth in Marco's chest vanished, replaced instantly by something cold, sharp, and terribly dark. A switch flipped inside his mind. He was Marco DeLuca, the most feared syndicate boss in the city. He controlled the ports, the politicians, the underground empires. He had slaughtered the men who murdered his wife, bathing the streets in their blood. He had spent millions of dollars flying in world-renowned psychologists, dragging his traumatized daughters to private islands and elite clinics, buying them ponies and castles. Nothing had worked. He had failed them completely. Yet here was a nobody, a common maid with calloused hands and a faded uniform, achieving the impossible in a matter of weeks. She had unlocked the fortress of their grief, and they were looking at her as if she were the sun. A sickening surge of inadequacy twisted into pure, blinding rage. It was a monstrous, prideful jealousy born from the agonizing shame of his own helplessness. How dare she succeed where he had failed? How dare they love her when they only gave him empty stares? The darkness that made him a ruthless king in the underworld rose up, demanding a target, demanding blood. "What the hell is going on in my house?" Marco roared, his voice detonating through the kitchen like a bomb. It was not the voice of a father. It was the voice of the boss, the sound that made hardened killers drop to their knees and beg for mercy. The singing died instantly. The laughter evaporated as if it had never existed. The heavy, suffocating silence of the past 14 months slammed back down on the room, crushing the air from their lungs. Mia shrieked in stark terror, scrambling backward to hide behind Jane's legs, her tiny hands twisting into the fabric of the maid's apron. Lucia and Valentina flinched violently on the counter, their eyes blowing wide with horror as they looked at the furious monster standing in the doorway. They huddled together, trembling violently. Jane did not scream, nor did she cower. She slowly reached down, her hands shaking as she gently touched Mia's hair to soothe the sobbing child. Then, she straightened her spine and looked directly into Marco's furious, dark eyes. "They were happy, sir," Jane said, her voice quiet but remarkably steady against his wrath. "This is the first time they have spoken. Can you not see that?" Marco stepped closer, the veins in his neck bulging, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned a ghastly white. "You do not tell me what my children need. You were hired to scrub floors, not play mother to my daughters." Jane stepped back once to shield Mia, but she lifted her chin, refusing to break eye contact with the man who could end her life with a single phone call. "I am the only one who has heard their voices, sir. You can throw your money and your anger around all you want, but you cannot deny that." The sheer audacity of her words struck Marco like a physical slap. No one spoke to him like that. His pride, already bruised and bleeding, shattered completely into petty, vindictive cruelty. "You are fired," he snarled, his eyes cold and empty. "Of all humanity. Pack your things. Get out of here right now." Jane stared at him for a long, agonizing moment, her brown eyes filled not with fear, but with a profound, crushing pity that made Marco want to tear the room apart. She slowly knelt down, prying Mia's desperate, grasping fingers from her apron. "I have to go, sweetie." "You be brave," Jane whispered, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She stood back up, squared her shoulders, and walked right past the most dangerous man in the city without a backward glance, leaving Marco standing alone in the deafening, heartbreaking sound of his 3 little girls sobbing in absolute terror. The days that followed were a living hell. The crushing silence returned to the massive estate, but this time it was infinitely worse. Before, the 3 little girls had been silent with the entire world, locked inside their own shared trauma, staring at the walls like empty vessels. But now, their silence had a specific target. It was a weapon forged from their shattered trust, and they aimed it directly at their father. On the first morning after Jane walked out the heavy iron gates, Marco woke up early, his chest tight with a desperate, suffocating guilt. He walked into the grand dining room, hoping to salvage whatever fragile piece remained. The triplets were already seated at the long mahogany table, 3 plates of untouched waffles sitting in front of them. The sweet scent of maple syrup filled the air, mocking the bitter tension in the room. The moment Marco pulled out his chair to sit at the head of the table, Lucia, Valentina, and Mia stood up in perfect unison. They did not look at the food. They did not look at him. Without making a single sound, they turned their backs and walked out of the room, their tiny footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. Marco was left sitting completely alone in the cavernous room, staring at 3 empty chairs, the absolute ruler of the city reduced to a pathetic ghost in his own home. He tried to brush it off, burying himself in the syndicate operations, ordering hostile takeovers and crushing rival gangs with a renewed, vicious brutality. He commanded an army of loyal soldiers. He held the fate of thousands in the palm of his scarred hand. Men twice his size trembled when he entered a room. But none of his money, none of his guns, and none of his terrifying reputation could make his daughters look him in the eye. On the 3rd night, the agony of their rejection became too heavy to bear. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 in the morning when Marco finally pushed himself out of his leather armchair in the study. The air in the mansion felt thick, suffocating him slowly. He walked up the sweeping staircase, his footsteps heavy and dragging, until he reached the heavy oak door of his daughter's bedroom. He turned the cold brass handle with trembling fingers and stepped inside. The room was bathed in the pale, silver light of the moon filtering through the sheer curtains. His 3 little angels were huddled together in the center of the massive bed, their hands tightly clasped even in their sleep, forming an unbreakable barricade against the world. Marco stood over them, his heart shattering into a million jagged pieces. He reached out a trembling hand, desperately wanting to stroke Lucia's dark curls, yearning for just a fraction of the warmth he had stolen from them. But before his fingers could brush her hair, Lucia's eyes snapped open. The oldest triplet did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply stared up at the towering, terrifying Mafia boss with a gaze so cold and hollow it froze the blood in Marco's veins. For the first time since Jane had left, Lucia parted her lips. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the quiet room with the precision of a sharpened blade. "You sent her away," the young girl said, her tone devoid of any childlike innocence. "I hate you." 3 simple words. They were not screamed in anger. They were delivered with an absolute, chilling certainty. Then, Lucia turned her back to him, pulling her sisters closer, shutting him out of her universe completely. Marco stopped breathing. His hand hovered in the empty air, paralyzed by a pain more agonizing than any bullet he had ever taken. He stumbled backward, retreating from the room as if he were a monster fleeing the light. He practically ran down the stairs, bursting into his dark study and slamming the door behind him. He collapsed into his chair, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unscrew the cap of the crystal whiskey decanter. He bypassed the glass entirely, bringing the heavy bottle to his lips and letting the burning liquid scorch his throat. But the alcohol could not numb the unbearable reality tearing him apart from the inside. On his desk sat a framed photograph of his late wife, her beautiful smile radiating a warmth he had sworn to protect. He picked up the silver frame, his large thumbs tracing the glass over her face as hot, stinging tears finally spilled over his eyelashes. Marco DeLuca, the ruthless king of the underworld, the man who made entire cartels tremble in fear, sat alone in the pitch-black dark and wept uncontrollably. He had built an indestructible empire of blood and shadow, yet he had destroyed the only beacon of light left in his miserable existence. His power was utterly meaningless. His wealth was useless. Paper. He was drowning in an ocean of his own pride, realizing too late that in his desperate attempt to maintain control, he had lost his family forever. Enzo Moretti had stood by Marco DeLuca for 15 years, rising from the brutal streets of the city to become the right hand of the most powerful syndicate boss in the country. He had seen Marco cold, calculating, and ruthless, but when he stepped into the shadowed study the following morning, he saw a man completely shattered. Marco sat behind his massive mahogany desk, still wearing the wrinkled suit from the day before, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. The empty whiskey decanter told a story Enzo did not need to ask about. Marco did not look up when he spoke, his voice raw and ragged as if he had swallowed glass. "Find her, Enzo. Find everything there is to know about Jane." Enzo did not hesitate. He nodded and left the room, tapping into the vast, invisible network of informants, corrupt police officers, and underworld contacts that the DeLuca syndicate controlled. By midnight, a thick manila folder rested on Marco's desk. Enzo stood on the other side of the heavy wood, watching his boss open the file. "Her full name is Jane Evans," Enzo began, his tone quiet and respectful. 24 years old. She lives in a rundown apartment in the worst part of the Narrows. She works 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, scrubbing corporate floors at night and pouring coffee at a local diner during the day. But that is not the part you need to read, boss. Marco's dark eyes scanned the typed pages, his jaw clenching as the devastating reality of Jane's life unfolded before him. 3 years ago, Jane's father, a hardworking mechanic who ran a tiny auto repair shop, was gunned down in broad daylight. He had refused to pay protection money to a rising street gang known as the Jackals. They shot him 3 times in the chest and left him bleeding out on the cold concrete while Jane was walking home from the grocery store. She had found him there, holding his calloused hand as he took his last breath. The police never solved the murder, sweeping it under the rug like just another statistic. 6 months later, her mother suffered a massive heart attack, her heart literally broken by the overwhelming grief of losing her husband. Then came Michael, Jane's younger brother. Only 19 years old, an honors student with a bright future, he was framed for drug trafficking and illegal weapons possession by corrupt cops working for the very same gang. He was sentenced to 10 years in a maximum security prison for a crime he absolutely did not commit. Jane was left entirely alone, carrying the crushing weight of her fractured family, pouring every single penny she earned from her grueling jobs into hiring an appeals lawyer to save her brother. She had lost everything, yet she still had enough love left inside her shattered heart to sing lullabies to Marco's traumatized daughters. While Marco had responded to his own monumental grief by drowning the city in violence and hiding behind the impenetrable walls of his estate, Jane had responded to her devastation by working herself to the bone, holding on to hope, and offering pure kindness to 3 little girls who desperately needed it. Marco felt a sickening knot twist deep in his stomach, but Enzo was not finished. "Look at the gang that killed her father, boss," Enzo said softly, pointing to a weathered police report attached to the back of the heavy file. "The Jackals." Marco froze, the name echoing loudly in his memory. 2 years ago, the Jackals had tried to expand their pathetic territory into the shipping docks exclusively controlled by the DeLuca family. Marco had not tolerated the blatant disrespect. He had given a single, cold order from this very desk. In one bloody night, his enforcers had completely wiped the Jackals off the map, executing every last member and burning their wretched hideouts to ashes. Marco stared at the paper, his hands beginning to tremble violently as the cosmic irony of the situation settled over him like a heavy shroud. He did not believe in destiny, but what else could this possibly be? Fate had brought them together. Jane had come to work for the very syndicate that had unknowingly slaughtered the brutal men who murdered her father. She had brought music and laughter back into the silent, agonizing world of his daughters, healing the family of the monster who had avenged her deepest tragedy without even realizing it. And in return, Marco had screamed at her, terrified her, and thrown her out into the freezing streets like garbage. The profound guilt that washed over him was absolutely suffocating. She was a woman built from pure resilience, a girl who had survived the darkest horrors of the world without letting it turn her soul to ice. She was stronger than any hardened soldier in his organization, infinitely stronger than Marco himself. Marco closed the file slowly, his chest heaving as he looked up at Enzo. The cold, impenetrable mask of the terrifying Mafia boss was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, agonizing clarity. He knew exactly what he had to do. He could not magically undo the cruelty he had inflicted on her, but he could finally surrender his massive ego. "Get the car ready," Marco whispered, his voice trembling with a newfound, terrifying vulnerability that Enzo had never witnessed before. "Where are we going, boss?" Enzo asked, his hand resting on the polished brass doorknob. Marco stood up, buttoning his ruined suit jacket as a flicker of desperate hope ignited in his bloodshot eyes. "We are going to the Narrows. I have to find her." The black town car crawled through the cracked, garbage-lined streets of the Narrows. Marco DeLuca sat in the back seat, staring out the tinted windows at a world he usually only saw through the lens of profit and territory. Here, the air was thick with desperation, the buildings crumbling under the weight of crushing poverty and relentless neglect. Enzo pulled the car to a slow stop across from a faded, grease-stained diner squeezed tightly between a desperate pawn shop and a boarded-up laundromat. The neon sign above the glass door flickered erratically, missing half its glowing letters. Marco stepped out into the freezing wind, purposely leaving his heavy cashmere overcoat on the luxurious leather seat. He wanted no armor today. As he pushed open the scratched glass door, the small bell jingled weakly, instantly drowned out by the clatter of cheap silverware and the loud, abrasive chatter of exhausted factory workers. The overwhelming smell of burnt coffee and old fried grease assaulted his sensitive senses, a stark, jarring contrast to the sterile, perfectly perfumed air of his isolated mansion. And there she was. Jane was furiously wiping down a sticky table in the far corner, her brown hair pulled back into a messy knot, deep dark circles bruising the delicate skin beneath her tired eyes. She wore a faded pink uniform that hung loosely on her thin frame, her small hands raw and red from harsh chemical cleaners. She moved with a mechanical, bone-deep exhaustion, balancing 4 heavy ceramic mugs on one arm while taking an order from a belligerent, loud customer, who barked his aggressive demands without even bothering to look up at her face. Marco silently slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the shadows, his large, intimidating frame awkwardly cramped in the uncomfortably small space. He did not order a single thing. He simply sat in the corner and watched the remarkable woman who had brought his traumatized daughters back to life. For 3 agonizing hours, he witnessed the sheer, grueling reality of her daily existence. He saw the red-faced manager yell at her across the room for accidentally dropping a metal spoon. He saw her secretly massage her aching lower back when she thought no one was paying attention. He saw her carefully count her meager, crumpled tips by the register, her lips moving silently as she likely calculated the mounting impossible legal fees to free her falsely imprisoned brother. The completely untouchable Mafia boss, a terrifying man who moved millions of dollars with a single stroke of a pen, felt entirely powerless, reduced to a silent, ashamed observer of a brutal struggle he had never once bothered to understand. When the rusted clock on the wall struck 4 in the afternoon, Jane slowly untied her stained apron and headed heavily for the back door to finally end her shift. Marco stood up, his chest pounding with a strange, unfamiliar terror that rivaled any violent shootout he had ever survived. He followed her quietly out into the narrow, trash-filled alleyway directly behind the diner. The freezing winter wind whipped harshly through the narrow brick corridor as the heavy metal door clanged, loudly shut behind her. Jane turned around, her shoulders slumping in exhaustion, and then she froze completely. Marco stood exactly 10 feet away from her, his large hands resting empty and open at his sides. For a long moment, the filthy alley was completely silent, interrupted only by the distant, wailing scream of a police siren. Jane did not scream for help or try to run away in terror. The paralyzing fear that usually gripped ordinary citizens when they faced the notorious boss of the DeLuca syndicate was completely absent from her calm amber eyes. Instead, there was only a deep, weary resignation born from a lifetime of relentless pain. "Did you come here to get me fired from this job too, Mr. DeLuca?" Jane asked, her voice cracking slightly from the biting cold. Her blunt words struck him like a physical blow to the chest. He absolutely deserved her simmering anger, her deep suspicion, her total hatred. Marco took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing his massive ego to shatter and leaving his legendary pride scattered on the filthy, frozen concrete. "No," Marco said, his deep voice completely stripped of all its usual commanding authority. "I came here to apologize to you." Jane let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head sadly as she pulled her thin, inadequate coat tighter around her violently shivering body. "You completely destroyed the only good thing that happened to your daughters in over a year, and you actually think a simple apology fixes that damage?" Marco flinched visibly, the absolute, undeniable truth of her cutting words slicing him straight to the bone. He looked down at his expensive Italian leather shoes, sinking slowly into the grime and slush of the alley, before forcing himself to lift his head and meet her unwavering gaze. "I know an apology does not fix it," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate, ragged whisper. "I was a jealous, arrogant fool. You did exactly what I spent millions of dollars trying to do. You saved my little girls, Jane. And the exact second you walked out that front door, they went right back into the terrible dark. They have not spoken a single word since you left my house. They will not even look at my face anymore." Jane closed her eyes tightly, a sharp breath hitching painfully in her chest as the agony of those 3 little girls resonated deeply within her own fractured heart. "I am begging you," Marco continued, the shameful words burning his throat like acid. "The undisputed king of the underworld, a ruthless man who commanded an army of killers and violently shattered rival empires, bowed his head to a poor waitress in a dirty alleyway. I am begging you to come back to the estate. Please. They need you to survive. I need you to save them." Jane opened her eyes slowly, studying the broken, desperate man standing freezing before her. She saw the dark circles mirroring her own exhaustion, the raw agony radiating from his tense, defeated posture. He had completely stripped away his terrifying Mafia armor, offering her absolutely nothing but the bleeding, helpless heart of a spectacularly failed father. But she had been crushed by the powerful, selfish men of this city too many times to simply surrender to his desperate pleas. Jane stared at the notorious Mafia boss standing before her in the freezing, trash-scattered alleyway. The bitter winter wind howled through the narrow brick corridor, pulling at her faded pink uniform, but the absolute desperation radiating from Marco DeLuca was colder than the falling snow. Marco pulled out his only weapon, the singular currency he truly understood and relied on to fix his broken world. He desperately offered to pay her double, triple, 10 times her current miserable wages. His deep voice rushed out in a frantic, uncharacteristic panic as he promised to hire the most expensive, elite appellate lawyers in the entire state for her falsely imprisoned brother, Michael. He confessed that his men had investigated her, that he knew everything about the tragic murder of her father at the hands of the jackals, and that he understood the agonizing, impossible burden she carried entirely on her own small shoulders. He thought this grand gesture, this display of limitless wealth and ultimate power, would be enough to bring her back to his silent fortress. Jane's amber eyes flared with a sudden, brilliant anger. The sheer audacity of his offer ignited a fierce, protective fire deep within her tired soul. She stepped closer to the towering, dangerous man, completely ignoring the invisible boundaries of mortal fear that kept the rest of the city paralyzed in his presence. "You actually think you can just buy me, Mr. DeLuca?" Jane asked, her voice trembling not from the bitter cold, but from absolute, raw fury. "You think you can simply throw your dirty blood money at my personal tragedies and erase the terrible things you did to those 3 little girls?" Marco opened his mouth to speak, but she cut him off, her voice rising sharply above the distant, mournful wail of police sirens echoing through the Narrows. "Do you have any idea what it felt like to be dragged out of that house like a criminal while the children I had grown to love screamed in sheer terror? You broke their tiny hearts all over again because your massive, fragile ego could not handle the simple fact that a lowly maid made them smile when you could not." She took a deep, shuddering breath, her chest heaving as hot tears of frustration gathered in the corners of her exhausted eyes. "I work 16 hours a day until my hands bleed and my bones ache. I eat leftover scraps from strangers' plates just so I can afford a public defender who barely even answers my phone calls. I have absolutely nothing left in this brutal world except my dignity and the sacred memories of the people I have lost. But I would rather starve to death in these freezing streets than let you use your millions to purchase my forgiveness." Marco stood completely frozen, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. No rival crime boss, no hardened assassin, no corrupt politician had ever dared to speak to him with such visceral, unyielding truth. His vast wealth, the very foundation of his immense power, was utterly worthless to this exhausted, practically invisible waitress. He swallowed hard, the sharp, bitter taste of profound shame coating his throat. "I just want to help," he whispered, sounding like a lost, broken child rather than the undisputed king of the underworld. Jane looked at his bowed head, her intense anger slowly melting into a heavy, melancholic sorrow. "If you truly want to help, then you need to fundamentally change," she stated with absolute, unshakable conviction. "Not just a superficial apology. Real, agonizing change. You cannot be the terrifying boss of a criminal syndicate and a loving, present father at the same exact time. You have to make a choice." Marco's dark eyes widened slightly, a flicker of genuine terror flashing across his handsome features. "You have to be home," Jane continued, her voice softening into a desperate, emotional plea for the 3 silent girls she missed so dearly. "You have to actually be there when they open their eyes in the morning. You have to sit down and eat breakfast with them, not read your terrible syndicate reports while they swallow cold food in absolute silence. You have to learn the names of their favorite toys, listen to their tiny fears, and sit by their beds until they fall asleep. They do not need a millionaire, Marco. They need a father." Marco felt a suffocating, heavy weight pressed down on his chest. She was asking him to surrender the very empire he had built for nothing, the ruthless persona that kept him alive in a world full of hungry wolves. "My work." He started to protest, his voice weak and unsure, but the words died painfully on his tongue. Your work killed their mother, Jane said gently, delivering the most devastating, agonizing truth of all. Marco flinched violently, stepping backward as if he had been physically shot in the heart. Blood calls for blood, Jane added, tears finally spilling over her dark lashes and freezing instantly on her pale cheeks. Isabella paid the ultimate price for the dangerous, violent world you chose. Do not make your innocent daughters pay for it too. Do not let your empire steal their father away when they have already lost so much. She wiped her wet face with the back of her raw, red hand and took a deliberate step backward toward the rusted diner door. I am getting you 3 days, Jane declared, her unwavering tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or compromise. 3 days to prove that you can put those beautiful girls above your pride and your absolute power. If you can do that, if you can truly be a father to them, then I will come back to that house and help you heal them. But if you cannot, then do not ever look for me again. Without waiting for a single word of confirmation or another desperate plea, Jane turned around, pulled open the heavy metal door, and disappeared back into the suffocating heat of the diner, leaving the most powerful man in the city standing entirely alone in the freezing, dark alleyway, holding the agonizing, crushing weight of his ultimate choice. The very next morning, the sprawling DeLuca estate experienced something it had not witnessed in over 15 years. Marco woke up at 6 o'clock, long before the winter sun began to bleed over the horizon. He did not reach for his encrypted phone. He did not strap the heavy leather shoulder holster over his chest. Instead of his custom-tailored black suits that cost more than most cars, he pulled on a simple gray sweater and a pair of worn jeans. He walked down the sweeping marble staircase, the deafening silence of the house pressing against his broad shoulders. When he entered the massive, stainless steel kitchen, his private chef turned around and nearly dropped a crystal bowl in pure shock. Marco quietly ordered the man to leave the room and take the rest of the day off. The undisputed king of the city was entirely alone, standing before a cold stove with trembling hands. He had orchestrated hostile takeovers and dismantled entire criminal syndicates with flawless precision, but looking at the eggs, flour, and milk on the counter, he felt entirely paralyzed. He clumsily cracked the eggs, wincing as shards of white shell fell into the glass bowl. He whisked the batter with far too much force, sending white powder flying across the immaculate granite countertops. By the time the antique grandfather clock chimed 7 times, the kitchen was filled with a thin haze of gray smoke and the unmistakable, bitter smell of scorched butter. Marco stared down at the 3 plates of burnt, misshapen pancakes in absolute misery. Then, he heard the soft, hesitant shuffling of tiny feet. Lucia, Valentina, and Mia stood frozen in the arched doorway of the kitchen, their small hands tightly gripping each other. They wore their matching pink pajamas, their dark eyes wide as they stared at the terrifying man who ruled the underworld. He was standing there with flour dusted across his dark hair, a smear of grease on his cheek, and a ridiculous white apron tied awkwardly around his muscular waist. The fearsome aura that made grown men beg for their lives was completely stripped away, leaving only a nervous, failing man holding a plastic spatula. Marco swallowed the heavy lump in his throat, carrying the 3 plates to the small wooden breakfast nook instead of the formal, cavernous dining room. "Good morning, my sweet girls," Marco said, his deep voice painfully soft, cracking with an agonizing vulnerability he had never let anyone see. "Daddy made breakfast today." He carefully set the burnt food down in front of them. The 3 little girls climbed into their chairs, their movements stiff and guarded. They stared down at the blackened pancakes, making no move to pick up their forks. Marco sat down directly across from them. He did not pull out his phone. He did not summon Enzo to read the daily security reports. He simply folded his large, deeply scarred hands on the table and waited. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. A violent, desperate urge to fix the situation clawed at Marco's chest. He wanted to call his staff, order a feast from the finest restaurant in the city, buy the mountains of toys, do anything to break the punishing quiet. But Jane's fierce, tearful words echoed loudly in his mind. "They do not need a millionaire, Marco. They need a father. So he forced himself to sit perfectly still. He endured the agonizing quiet. The girls did not eat a single bite of the terrible food, but for the first time since Jane had left, they did not stand up and walk away. They sat there for 20 minutes, occasionally glancing up at his messy hair and flour-covered clothes, their empty eyes filled with a quiet, cautious confusion. When they finally slid out of their chairs and moved to the sitting room to play, Marco followed them. He did not retreat to the safety of his dark study. He walked into the bright, sunlit room and lowered his massive frame onto the soft woven rug, sitting a few feet away from where his daughters were coloring with crayons. He felt entirely absurd, a lethal predator sitting cross-legged on a child's playmat, stripped of all his weapons and wealth. Hours bled into the afternoon. His knees ached, and his syndicate was likely in chaos without his constant direction, but Marco did not move. He watched the way the sunlight caught Mia's eyelashes. He listened to the soft, rhythmic scraping of Valentina's blue crayon against the thick paper. He paid attention to the fiercely protective way Lucia positioned herself slightly in front of her sisters. He did not try to force them to talk. He did not demand their love. He simply offered his absolute, undivided presence, breathing in the same space, swallowing his monumental pride, and allowing his beautiful daughters to see him not as a monster, not as a boss, but just as a broken man trying desperately to learn how to be a dad. On the second day of the agonizing 3-day ultimatum Jane had laid before him, Marco DeLuca awoke long before the winter sun completely breached the gray horizon. The sprawling estate was suffocatingly quiet, but today, he did not fight the terrible silence. He embraced it. He left his encrypted cell phone locked securely inside his heavy iron safe, entirely ignoring the mounting, urgent syndicate crises that Enzo would undoubtedly be struggling to manage on his own. Marco walked down to the kitchen, carefully preparing a simple breakfast of buttered toast and sliced fruit, desperate to avoid the disastrous, smoke-filled failure of the previous morning. When Lucia, Valentina, and Mia cautiously entered the dining room, they found their father already sitting at the long table, wearing a faded cotton shirt instead of his terrifying, tailored armor. They ate in absolute silence, but Marco noticed a subtle, microscopic shift in the room. Their tiny shoulders were not wound quite as tightly as before. Their dark eyes darted toward him with a lingering, curious wonder rather than stark, paralyzing terror. As the morning slowly bled into a quiet, snow-muffled afternoon, Marco followed them into the sprawling, sunlit conservatory. He sat down heavily on the thick, plush carpet, leaning his broad, scarred back against a velvet armchair, completely surrendering his towering physical dominance. For 4 agonizing, stretching hours, he simply existed in their space. He did not speak. He did not try to force them to interact. He held a worn, beautifully illustrated children's book in his large, calloused hands, silently turning the heavy pages while his daughters built fragile towers out of colorful wooden blocks a few feet away. The monumental restraint it took to remain perfectly still rivaled the intense, calculated discipline he needed to survive bloody gang wars in the Narrows. Every instinct in his powerful body screamed at him to take control, to fix the broken situation with absolute authority, but he ruthlessly crushed those impulses, remembering the profound, furious tears in Jane's amber eyes. He had to be a father, not a boss. He watched the way the pale winter sunlight illuminated the dust motes around them, creating a golden halo over their identical, dark curls. He noticed how Valentina always categorized her blocks by color before building, a meticulous habit she had inherited directly from her murdered mother. He saw how Lucia constantly monitored the perimeter of the room, her small shoulders carrying the heavy, tragic burden of an adult protector. These were beautiful, profound details he had completely missed for 14 months because he had been too busy drowning the city in blood to avenge a ghost. The crushing weight of his monumental failures threatened to suffocate him, but he forced himself to swallow the bitter panic. As the winter sun began its slow descent, painting the conservatory windows in bleeding strokes of violet and deep gold, a loud, wooden clatter shattered the quiet peace. Mia, the youngest and most fragile of the triplets, had accidentally knocked over her towering block castle. The heavy wooden pieces scattered across the thick rug, one painted red block rolling to a complete stop directly against Marco's knee. The room went perfectly, terrifyingly still. Lucia and Valentina froze, their breath catching in their tiny throats, instinctively waiting for the terrifying, explosive anger their father had unleashed in the kitchen just days ago. Marco did not move a single muscle. He kept his breathing slow and steady, his heart hammering violently against his ribs like a trapped bird. He did not reach out to hand the block back. He waited. Mia stared at the red block resting against his leg. She looked up, her huge brown eyes locking onto Marco's face, searching for the terrifying monster who had chased away the only woman who made her smile. But she did not find the monster. She only found a tired, hopeful man with a desperate, pleading softness in his dark eyes. Slowly, agonizingly, the little girl stood up. She took one tiny, hesitant step forward, then another. The distance between them was only 3 feet, but to Marco, it felt like crossing a vast, impossible ocean. Mia reached his side. She did not immediately reach down for the fallen toy. Instead, she stood incredibly close to his knee, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. Then, she raised her tiny, trembling hand. Marco stopped breathing entirely. Mia reached out, her small fingers gently brushing against the thick, raised scar on the back of his massive hand. The physical contact was impossibly light, as fleeting and fragile as the brush of a butterfly wing, but it sent a massive, electric shockwave of pure, unadulterated joy straight through Marco's shattered soul. She let her small hand rest over his rough knuckles for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds of absolute, undeniable forgiveness. 2 seconds of pure, unconditional trust. Then, she slowly bent down, picked up her red wooden block, and retreated to the safety of her sisters, leaving Marco completely undone. Hot, thick tears instantly flooded his eyes, blurring his vision as a raw, strangled breath finally escaped his throat. "Thank you," Marco whispered, his voice cracking into a broken sob. He did not wipe the tears away. He let them fall freely, weeping in silence on the floor of the conservatory. That single, microscopic touch was the most profound, powerful victory of his entire violent life. Jane had been absolutely right. His money and his power were completely useless, but his patience and his gentle presence had just bought him the entire world. The sun rose on the 3rd day, casting a pale, trembling light over the massive DeLuca estate. Marco had not slept a single minute. He stood by the towering bay windows of the living room, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal in a cage. He had spent the last 48 hours entirely stripped of his power, offering his daughters nothing but his broken, quiet presence and his terrible cooking. Now, the absolute final day of Jane's agonizing ultimatum had arrived. The 3 little girls were sitting on the plush rug, uncharacteristically restless, their dark eyes darting toward the grand entrance every few minutes. They did not know the exact details of the promise, but children possess an intuitive, desperate understanding of hope. At precisely 8 o'clock in the morning, the heavy iron gates of the estate slowly swung open. A battered yellow taxi crawled up the pristine, stone-paved driveway, a vehicle that had absolutely no business being inside the heavily fortified compound of a syndicate boss. Marco stopped breathing. His scarred hands gripped the heavy velvet drapes so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. The taxi door opened, and Jane stepped out into the freezing winter air. She wore the same faded, inadequate coat, her brown hair pulled back simply, clutching a small, worn duffel bag in her raw hands. Enzo, who was standing guard at the front door, did not pat her down or block her path. He simply stepped aside and pulled the heavy oak door open with a look of profound, silent gratitude. Jane walked into the grand hallway. The soft, familiar scent of her vanilla soap immediately cut through the sterile, expensive air of the mansion. Marco stepped out of the shadows of the living room, his towering frame trembling visibly. He did not say a single word. He only looked at her, his dark eyes overflowing with a desperate, naked relief. Then, a tiny gasp broke the heavy silence. Mia dropped her wooden block on the carpet. "Miss Jane," the little girl whispered, her voice cracking. And then the quiet fortress completely exploded. "Miss Jane! Miss Jane!" All three girls screamed at the exact same time, their bright voices filling the cavernous room, shattering the 14 months of agonizing darkness into a million brilliant pieces. They ran. They scrambled over the rug, their small feet slipping on the polished marble as they sprinted toward the entrance like three desperate angels finally finding their lost heaven. Jane dropped her duffel bag onto the floor. She fell hard to her knees, opening her arms as wide as she possibly could. The triplets crashed into her chest, burying their tear-stained faces into her neck, her shoulders, and her freezing coat. "You came back," Lucia sobbed violently, her tiny hands twisting deeply into Jane's collar. "We thought you were gone forever." Jane wrapped her arms tightly around all three of them, pulling them impossibly close, burying her face in their dark curls as hot, heavy tears streamed down her own pale cheeks. "I am here, my sweet angels," Jane cried, her voice completely muffled by their hair. "I am so incredibly sorry I left you. I should never have walked out that door. Will you please forgive me?" "Yes," Valentina wailed, clinging desperately to Jane's arm. "We forgive you." Marco stood a few feet away, watching the profound, beautiful miracle unfolding on his foyer floor. The most ruthless, terrifying man in the city was openly weeping, the tears carving clean tracks through the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. He did not care if his hardened soldiers saw him. He did not care about his terrifying reputation. He only cared about the pure, blinding light radiating from his daughters. Lucia pulled back slightly, her big brown eyes looking up at Jane with a fragile, terrified hope. "Are you staying?" the young girl asked, her voice trembling like a dead leaf in the winter wind. "Are you going to leave us again?" Jane looked over the girls' heads, finally meeting Marco's tear-filled eyes. She saw the total surrender in his slumped posture, the absolute death of his massive ego. He slowly, deliberately nodded his head, confirming the silent, sacred vow he had made to her in that freezing alleyway. Jane smiled radiantly through her tears, looking back down at the three beautiful girls she loved as if they were her own flesh and blood. "I am staying," Jane promised, kissing Mia's wet forehead gently. "I am never leaving this house again." Valentina suddenly turned around, pointing a small, trembling finger at Marco. "Daddy said he was sorry," she announced, her voice filled with a sudden, fierce pride. "Daddy sat on the floor with us." Marco slowly walked forward and sank to his knees right beside Jane, bringing himself down completely to their level. "Daddy was very wrong," Marco said, his deep voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "I asked Miss Jane to come back because I love you, and because we need her to be a real family." Lucia looked at her father for a long, quiet moment. Then, she reached out and grabbed his scarred, calloused hand, pulling it forward until it rested right next to Jane's soft hand on Mia's back. The massive estate was no longer a silent tomb. It was alive with the chaotic, beautiful, messy sound of a broken family finally breathing together. 6 weeks passed since the morning Jane walked back through the heavy iron gates of the DeLuca estate, and the sprawling mansion had completely transformed. The suffocating, sterile silence that had choked the halls for 14 months was entirely gone, replaced by the chaotic, beautiful symphony of a family learning how to breathe again. Marco DeLuca, the terrifying undisputed king of the underworld, was systematically dismantling his own absolute reign. He still technically controlled the shipping ports and the lucrative underground casinos, but he was no longer the ruthless, ever-present phantom haunting the violent city streets. He handed the vast majority of his daily operations over to Enzo, ordering his loyal right-hand man to handle the violent disputes in the Narrows and negotiate the volatile syndicate treaties. Marco restricted his criminal empire to the heavy oak doors of his study, and even then, he only allowed himself 3 strict hours of work each morning. The rest of his time belonged entirely to his daughters and to Jane. He was learning how to be a real father from the ground up, swallowing his massive pride every single day. He was there in the bright kitchen every morning, standing beside Jane at the marble island. She gently taught him how to measure flour and whisk eggs without destroying the entire room, and soon, his burned offerings turned into golden, edible pancakes that actually made Mia giggle with absolute delight. They ate breakfast together at the small wooden table, no longer separated by the cavernous, intimidating dining room. Marco listened intently as Valentina asked 100 endless questions about why the winter sky was gray or how snow melted on the cold window glass, answering each one with a quiet, patient devotion he never knew he possessed. He learned the specific names of the dolls Lucia guarded so fiercely, and he knew exactly which stuffed bear Mia needed to hold before she could take a nap. Jane was no longer just the maid scrubbing the floors in the shadows. She had become the vital, beating heart of the entire household. She sat next to Marco during family dinners, their shoulders occasionally brushing, sending a sudden, electric warmth straight through his chest. In the evenings, the terrifying Mafia boss and the exhausted waitress shared the mundane domestic duties that most ordinary people took for granted. Marco would carefully wash the dishes while Jane dried them, the two of them moving around each other in the massive kitchen in a quiet, comfortable dance. When the antique grandfather clock chimed 8 times, they walked upstairs together to the girls' bedroom. Marco no longer stood helplessly in the doorway. He sat right on the edge of the large bed, his heavy, scarred hands carefully holding a brightly illustrated storybook. "You are reading it entirely too fast, Marco," Jane would whisper with a soft smile, leaning gently over his broad shoulder. "You have to let them look at the beautiful pictures." Marco would look up at her, a genuine, unguarded smile breaking across his hardened, scarred face. "I am trying my very best, Jane," he would reply softly, the absolute truth of those words echoing deep in his chest. The next night, Jane would read, her sweet, melodic voice washing over the dimly lit room like a warm summer breeze. Marco would sit in the velvet armchair in the corner, ostensibly watching the children, but his dark, intense eyes always drifted back to Jane. He watched the way the soft lamplight caught the golden strands in her brown hair. He watched the gentle, maternal way she tucked the heavy blankets around Lucia's small shoulders. He watched her entirely, utterly captivated by the incredible woman who had reached into the darkest, most terrifying depths of his life and pulled him back into the light. Jane noticed his heavy gaze, of course. She would occasionally look up from the pages of the book, her amber eyes meeting his across the quiet room, and a profound, unspoken understanding would pass between them. They did not speak of the simmering, desperate romantic tension growing steadily between them. They did not label the deep, undeniable connection that made Marco's heart hammer violently whenever she entered the room. They simply existed in this fragile, newly built sanctuary, allowing the deep, jagged wounds of their respective pasts to slowly knit together. Marco was completely terrified of breaking the beautiful peace they had built, terrified that his violent, bloody world would somehow reach out and poison her pure, innocent soul. But every time Jane smiled at him over the breakfast table, every time she gently corrected his clumsy attempts to braid Mia's dark hair, the ruthless monster inside him quieted a little more. He was no longer running from his monumental grief or burying his failures in senseless bloodshed. He was simply standing still, planting his feet firmly in the present, and dedicating every single breath in his lungs to protecting the delicate, beautiful foundation of his reborn family. For months after Jane returned to the estate, Marco DeLuca fulfilled the quiet, sacred vow he had made in that freezing alleyway in the Narrows. He did not boast about his efforts or demand her gratitude over the family dinner table. Instead, he worked entirely in the shadows, orchestrating a massive, relentless legal campaign to free 19-year-old Michael from his unjust imprisonment. Marco did not use the violent, bloody intimidation tactics of the underworld. He weaponized his limitless wealth and vast connections within the legitimate justice system. He hired the most ruthless, expensive appellate lawyers in the entire state, a team of legal sharks who completely tore apart the original, fabricated case file. They relentlessly investigated the corrupt police officers who had planted the drugs and illegal weapons in Michael's car, exposing their direct financial ties to the now-deceased Jackal Street gang. They found the glaring inconsistencies, intimidated the lying witnesses into recanting their false testimonies, and applied suffocating pressure on the district attorney until the fragile, corrupt case completely collapsed. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Michael's conviction was officially overturned. Jane had been standing outside the towering, concrete walls of the maximum security prison since dawn. She could not sit still, her heart hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against her ribs as she clutched the rusted chain-link fence. For 3 brutal years, she had worked herself to the absolute bone, sacrificing her youth, her health, and her own dreams to save the only family she had left. Now, as the heavy steel gates finally began to slide open with a loud, mechanical groan, her breath completely left her lungs. A tall, pale young man walked out into the pale morning sunlight. Michael was thinner than she remembered, his shoulders carrying the invisible, crushing weight of a cage he had never deserved, but his dark eyes were still bright with the same innocent, hopeful spirit he had possessed before the world broke them both. "Jane," Michael called out, his voice cracking violently with disbelief. Jane did not wait another second. She sprinted across the cracked pavement, her tears blinding her as she threw her arms around her little brother's neck. She held him with a desperate, terrifying strength, sobbing uncontrollably into his thin shoulder. "You are home," she cried, kissing his cheeks, his forehead, his hair. "You are finally home." Michael wrapped his arms tightly around her trembling frame, burying his face in her hair as he wept just as fiercely. They stood there in the shadow of the brutal prison, completely ignoring the armed guards and the passing cars, clinging to each other as if 3 agonizing years of separation had been compressed into a single, breathtaking moment of pure salvation. Marco DeLuca stood silently beside his armored black sedan parked exactly 50 yards away. He did not step forward to claim any credit. He did not intrude on their sacred, desperately earned reunion. He simply stood in the cold morning wind, his hands resting quietly in the pockets of his dark coat, watching the profound miracle unfold with a heavy, melancholic warmth expanding in his chest. After a long, emotional embrace, Michael finally lifted his head from his sister's shoulder. He looked past Jane, his sharp eyes locking directly onto the imposing, terrifying figure of the syndicate boss standing by the expensive car. Michael instantly recognized the dangerous, undeniable aura of a man who commanded the underworld, but he also saw the gentle, protective way Marco was looking at Jane. "Is that the man who saved me?" Michael asked softly, his voice full of quiet awe. Jane turned around, wiping her tear-stained cheeks as she looked at Marco. Her amber eyes were completely overwhelmed with a profound, birth-shattering gratitude that she could not even begin to put into words. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with raw emotion. "He is the man who saved us both." Michael gently pulled away from his sister and walked slowly toward the armored car. He stopped a few feet away from the undisputed king of the city, standing tall despite the terrible ordeal he had just survived. "I do not know exactly who you are, sir," Michael said, his voice steady and sincere. "But I know that I owe you my entire life. Thank you." Marco looked at the brave young man, seeing the same fierce, unbroken resilience that burned so brightly in Jane's soul. He gave a slow, respectful nod, his dark eyes entirely devoid of his usual terrifying arrogance. "You owe me absolutely nothing, Michael," Marco replied gently, his deep voice carrying the absolute truth of his reformed heart. "Live a good, honorable life, and take care of your sister. That is the only thanks I will ever need." Jane walked up beside her brother, gently slipping her small hand into his. She looked up at Marco, completely stripping away the invisible walls she had built to protect herself from the brutal world. In that quiet, breathtaking moment, she realized that the fearsome, dangerous Mafia boss had not just kept his promise. He had fundamentally rewritten his own soul to become a man truly worthy of her love. As the long, brutal winter finally began to thaw into the fragile warmth of early spring, the invisible boundaries that had safely separated the ruthless syndicate boss from the resilient Maid completely dissolved. The sprawling DeLuca estate was no longer a heavily guarded fortress of grief. It had become a genuine sanctuary, and at the absolute center of that profound peace were Marco and Jane. The shift between them did not happen with a grand, dramatic declaration, but rather through 1,000 quiet, lingering moments that slowly wove their fractured souls together. It was in the way Marco's dark, intense eyes would instinctively seek Jane the exact second he walked into a room, softening instantly the moment he found her. It was in the gentle, agonizingly slow way Jane would reach out to brush a trace of flour from his muscular forearm when they cooked breakfast together, leaving a blazing trail of heat against his skin long after she pulled her hand away. Enzo noticed it. Michael, who visited the estate every Sunday, certainly noticed it. Even the three little girls seemed to understand the magnetic, undeniable pull between their father and the woman who had saved them all. The true depth of their unspoken connection always revealed itself in the dead of night, long after Lucia, Valentina, and Mia had fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. On a rainy Thursday evening, the heavy, rhythmic drumming of the spring storm against the tall conservatory windows created a cocoon of absolute isolation around them. Marco and Jane sat close together on the plush velvet sofa, a single, dim amber lamp casting long, intimate shadows across the quiet room. 2 cups of chamomile tea sat forgotten on the low mahogany table. Marco had discarded his expensive suit jacket hours ago, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, exposing the faded, violent scars of his brutal past. He leaned back against the cushions, his head turned slightly so he could watch Jane. She was curled up with her legs tucked beneath her, staring out at the driving rain, her beautiful face illuminated by the occasional, distant flash of lightning. "You are thinking too loudly, Jane," Marco murmured, his deep, gravelly voice barely rising above the sound of the heavy downpour. Jane turned her head, her amber eyes meeting his dark gaze, completely devoid of the terror she had once harbored for the undisputed king of the city. "I was just thinking about how terrifyingly beautiful this piece feels," she whispered, her voice laced with a fragile, lingering vulnerability. "For 3 agonizing years, my entire existence was a desperate, exhausting war. And now, sitting here in this beautiful house, watching your daughters laugh and seeing my brother smile again, I almost feel guilty for being this happy." Marco felt a sharp, profound ache twist deep in his chest. He slowly shifted his massive frame closer to her, closing the torturous, agonizing distance that still remained between them. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently covering her small, rough fingers resting on the sofa cushion. His touch was incredibly hesitant, terrified that his violent, blood-stained hands would somehow shatter her pure, brilliant light. But Jane did not pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, her small fingers naturally intertwining with his scarred ones. "You have absolutely nothing to feel guilty about, Jane," Marco said softly, his thumb tracing slow, rhythmic circles against her delicate skin. "You fought through the darkest, most brutal hell this city has to offer, and you survived it with your beautiful soul completely intact. You earned every single second of this peace." Jane looked down at their joined hands, a silent, profound testament to the impossible bridge they had built between their 2 drastically different worlds. "And what about you, Marco?" she asked, her voice dropping to a breathy, intimate whisper as she slowly lifted her gaze back to his face. "Have you found your peace?" Marco looked deeply into her amber eyes, the remaining, shattered fragments of his ruthless Mafia armor completely falling away. He did not see just a maid, or a woman he had saved. He saw his absolute equal, the fierce, unyielding woman who had forced him to rip out his own toxic pride and become the father his daughters desperately needed. The romantic, electric tension that had been quietly simmering between them for months finally boiled over, making the air in the quiet conservatory feel impossibly thick and heavy. He leaned in, his face only inches from hers, his dark eyes burning with an intense, overwhelming adoration that he could no longer deny or hide. "My peace is sitting right here in front of me," Marco confessed, the raw, undeniable truth of his words, vibrating in the small space between their lips. I spent my entire life building an empire out of blood and fear, thinking that absolute power was the only way to survive. But none of it matters. None of my money, none of my territory, none of my reputation means a single thing without you. Jane's breath hitched, her heart hammering a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs as she reached up with her free hand, her fingertips gently resting against the rough stubble of his strong jaw. Marco instinctively leaned into her tender touch, closing his eyes for a brief, agonizing second as he completely surrendered the very last of his dark, isolated soul to her brilliant light. When he opened his eyes, the undeniable, overwhelming love staring back at him from Jane's beautiful face shattered. The final, lingering doubts in his mind, cementing a profound, unbreakable bond that neither of them would ever be able to walk away from. The fragile peace of the DeLuca estate was violently tested exactly 2 weeks later when the dark, inescapable echoes of the underworld finally breached their sanctuary walls. It was a torrential Tuesday evening when Enzo burst through the heavy oak doors of Marco's private study, his usually stoic face grim and slick with rain. A massive, incredibly lucrative territory dispute had erupted in the northern shipping ports, triggered by a ruthless, rising syndicate boss named Dominic Vance. Vance was a vicious, bloodthirsty predator who had just executed 3 of Marco's top lieutenants, leaving their bodies displayed in the open streets to force a devastating gang war. Millions of dollars and the absolute, terrifying reputation of the DeLuca family were on the line. The old, dormant monster. Inside, Marco instantly woke from its slumber. The familiar, intoxicating rush of cold, calculated violence flooded his veins, completely drowning out the soft, domestic warmth he had cultivated over the past months. Marco did not hesitate. His scarred hands mechanically reached into the heavy iron safe, pulling out the custom leather shoulder holster he had not touched since the day Jane returned. He strapped the cold, heavy steel of his weapon across his chest, shedding the soft gray sweater for a crisp, tailored black suit that served as his lethal armor. He was the undisputed king of the city, and blood called for blood. He ordered Enzo to assemble their most lethal enforcers, preparing to descend upon Vance's stronghold and eradicate the rival faction with overwhelming, merciless brutality. But as Marco stepped out of the dark study and marched down the dimly lit hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing with violent intent, he stopped dead in his tracks. Jane was standing at the bottom of the grand marble staircase. She was wearing a simple, soft white dress, her brown hair falling loosely over her shoulders, holding a small, brightly painted clay mug that Mia had made for him earlier that afternoon. Jane did not scream. She did not block his path or beg him to stay. She simply looked at the dark, perfectly tailored suit, her amber eyes locking onto the slight, telltale bulge of the weapon hidden beneath his expensive jacket. The profound, shattered disappointment that washed over her beautiful face hit Marco harder than a physical bullet to the chest. The terrifying Mafia boss froze, caught exactly between the 2 violently opposing halves of his soul. On one side was the bloody, unforgiving empire he had built from nothing, demanding absolute dominance, demanding that he step out into the freezing rain and crush Dominic Vance to preserve his terrifying legacy. On the other side was the incredibly fragile, beautiful family he had just barely managed to tape back together. Jane's gaze did not waver. She looked at him with a quiet, devastating sorrow, silently reminding him of the sacred, absolute vow he had made in the freezing alleyway of the Narrows. She was asking him to choose. You cannot be the terrifying boss of a criminal syndicate and a loving, present father at the same exact time. Her past words echoed loudly in the cavernous hallway, ringing in his ears over the distant, muffled thunder of the storm outside. Marco looked down at his scarred hands, the very hands that had caused so much pain, the hands that Mia had bravely touched, the hands that Jane had held in the dark conservatory. If he walked out those heavy iron doors tonight, he would absolutely win the war against Vance, but he would permanently lose his soul. He would cross a bloody threshold that would forever taint the pure, innocent sanctuary he had built for his daughters. The agonizing silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, the fate of his entire existence balancing on the edge of a knife. Marco closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath that rattled in his broad chest. He slowly reached inside his tailored jacket, his fingers wrapping around the cold steel of his gun. But he did not draw it to fight. With trembling, deliberate movements, Marco unbuckled the leather holster, pulling the heavy weapon from his chest, and placed it onto the small mahogany table beside him. The heavy thud of the gun against the wood sounded like a final, absolute surrender. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his encrypted phone, and dialed Enzo. "Stand down," Marco ordered, his deep voice unwavering, completely devoid of the brutal violence that had once defined him. "Cede the northern ports to Vance. Let him have the territory. I am stepping away from the syndicate permanently. Tell the men that my reign is officially over." He hung up the phone before Enzo could even utter a single word of protest, dropping the encrypted device right next to the discarded weapon. Marco had just surrendered millions of dollars and his entire, terrifying legacy with a single phone call. He looked up, his chest heaving with a sudden, overwhelming freedom, and met Jane's tear-filled amber eyes. She slowly placed the small clay mud on the staircase railing and walked toward him, her hands reaching out to grip his lapels, pulling him down into a fierce, desperate, and incredibly tender kiss. Marco wrapped his massive arms around her waist, burying his face in her soft hair, holding on to her as if she were the only anchor keeping him from drifting into the abyss. He had finally made the ultimate choice, completely turning his back on the shadowy echoes of the underworld, choosing the warm, beautiful light of his future over the cold, bloody ghosts of his past. One golden Saturday afternoon, when the harsh winter had fully surrendered to the gentle, breathing warmth of late spring, the western sky was washed in brilliant shades of orange and soft pink. Marco DeLuca stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the conservatory and walked down the stone path toward the sprawling backyard of the estate. He had spent the morning finalizing the total, irreversible transfer of his remaining underworld assets, completely cutting the final, lingering ties to the bloody empire that had once defined his entire existence. A profound, unfamiliar lightness settled in his broad chest as he followed the clear, beautiful sound of laughter echoing from the edge of the manicured lawn. When he rounded the corner of the tall emerald hedges, the sight before him made his breath catch in his throat. Jane and the three little girls were kneeling side by side in the rich, damp soil of a freshly turned garden bed. Their clothes were heavily streaked with dark mud, and their hands were completely covered in dirt, but no one cared about the mess. They were smiling radiantly, their faces glowing in the late afternoon sun as Jane gently guided MIA's small hands to dig a shallow hole in the earth. Marco walked closer, his heavy footsteps muffled by the thick green grass, feeling an overwhelming wave of absolute, terrifying love for the four incredible women sitting in the dirt. "What are we planting today?" Marco asked, his deep voice carrying a soft, teasing warmth that he had completely forgotten how to use. For beautiful faces lifted to look at him, their dark eyes shining with pure joy. "Sunflowers, Daddy," Mia shouted excitedly, proudly holding up her muddy, tiny hands like a hard-won trophy. Lucia, sitting cross-legged beside her younger sister, looked up at Marco with a sudden, profound seriousness that made her look remarkably like her late mother. "Miss Jane said that Mommy really liked sunflowers," Lucia explained, her small voice steady and clear. "So we are planting a whole garden of them right here, so Mommy can look down from heaven and see them blooming every single summer." Marco felt his throat tighten painfully, a sudden rush of hot, stinging tears gathering perfectly in the corners of his eyes. He looked over at Jane, who was watching him with a fierce, gentle encouragement, giving him a small, silent nod that told him it was absolutely safe to finally let go of his towering grief. Marco did not hesitate. He dropped straight down onto his knees right beside his daughters, letting his expensive trousers sink deeply into the wet, muddy earth. "Your mom loved sunflowers more than anything else in the whole world," Marco said, his voice incredibly thick with heavy, unshed tears. "They were the most beautiful flowers she had ever seen." Valentina tilted her head, her dark curls falling over her muddy cheek as she looked at her father with intense curiosity. "Why did Mommy like them so much, Daddy?" Why sunflowers and not red roses or pink tulips? Marco was completely quiet for a long, stretching moment. He looked down at the tiny, striped seeds resting in the palm of Jane's hand, and then he looked up at the vast, endless sky turning a deep, bruising purple as the sun continued to set. Your mom once told me a very special secret about sunflowers, Marco began, his voice dropping to a reverent, hushed whisper as his daughters leaned in closer to listen. She told me that sunflowers always turn their faces toward the light. No matter how incredibly dark the world gets, no matter how black the storm clouds are, and no matter how hard the bitter rain falls, sunflowers absolutely never give up. They refuse to turn away into the shadows. They keep searching the sky until they find the sun. Lucia looked deeply into her father's eyes, her own eyes shimmering with unshed tears and a profound, beautiful understanding that was far too old for her young years. Just like us, the brave little girl said softly. We are. Exactly like the sunflowers, aren't we, Daddy? We were hiding in the terrible dark for a very long time, but then we finally found the light. Marco completely broke down. He reached forward and pulled his brilliant, resilient daughter into his massive arms, burying his face in her dark hair as he openly wept. That is absolutely right, my sweet angel, Marco whispered brokenly, pressing a fierce kiss to her forehead. You found the light, and you helped Daddy find it, too. Valentina and Mia immediately scrambled over the dirt to join the embrace, wrapping their small, muddy arms tightly around their father's broad shoulders. Jane shifted closer, wrapping her own arms around the entire tangled pile of weeping, healing humanity, pressing her cheek against Marco's strong back. As they held each other in the warm soil, a sudden gasp from Mia broke the quiet sound of their shared, cleansing tears. Look, Daddy, Mia whispered, pointing a tiny finger up at the twilight sky. A single, brilliantly purple butterfly drifted down from the canopy of the ancient oak trees. It fluttered gracefully in circles around the huddled family before coming to a gentle, perfect rest right on top of the open packet of sunflower seeds. The three girls went absolutely silent, staring at the fragile, beautiful creature in pure awe. It is Mommy, isn't it? Mia asked, her voice trembling with absolute, innocent certainty. Mommy came down to visit our garden. Jane reached out and gently stroked the little girl's dark curls, her amber eyes swimming with tears. Yes, sweetheart, Jane said softly. Mommy is always watching over you. She is always going to be right here in the warm sunshine, in the cool summer wind, and in the beautiful butterfly wings. She is incredibly proud of you, and she will never, ever leave you. The purple butterfly lingered for just a few seconds more, slowly opening and closing its vibrant wings as if it were sending them one final, silent embrace. Then, it lifted off the seed packet, catching a warm updraft of evening air, and flew higher and higher until it completely disappeared into the golden, fading light of the setting sun. The five of them stayed there in the garden long after the sun had fully set, their hands completely covered in dirt, planting the tiny seeds together as one completely united, unbreakable family. They were not perfect, and they all carried deep, permanent scars from their tragic pasts, but as they knelt in the earth together, they knew with absolute certainty that they had finally survived the brutal winter and were ready to bloom forever. The transition of power was entirely silent, completely devoid of the brutal bloodshed that usually marked the end of a syndicate king. Marco DeLuca handed the keys to his sprawling, violent empire over to Enzo, leaving the dark, treacherous underworld behind without a single lingering regret. He traded his terrifying throne for a completely different kind of kingdom, one built inside the sunlit walls of his estate, where the only demands placed upon him were reading bedtime stories and wiping muddy hands. 1 year after Jane had walked back through the heavy iron gates, the massive mansion was completely unrecognizable. The suffocating, sterile silence of the past had been permanently replaced by the constant, beautiful chaos of three energetic little girls running through the wide hallways. It was a warm Sunday morning, and the golden sunlight poured through the towering bay windows of the kitchen, illuminating the spectacular mess they had made while cooking breakfast. Marco stood by the marble island, wearing a faded gray shirt and worn jeans, watching Jane laugh loudly as Mia playfully smeared a dash of white flour across Valentina's cheek. Lucia was carefully arranging strawberries on a plate, her tiny brow furrowed in deep concentration, looking so incredibly peaceful. Jane looked breathtakingly beautiful, her amber eyes completely free of the deep, exhausting shadows that had once haunted her every waking moment. She was no longer the invisible, broken maid scrubbing floors to survive the cruel, freezing streets of the Narrows. She was the absolute center of their entire universe, the fierce, radiant sun around which Marco and his daughters gladly revolved. Marco walked up slowly behind her, gently wrapping his strong, scarred arms around her waist and pulling her back against his solid chest. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the crown of her head, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of vanilla that had become his ultimate sanctuary. Jane leaned back into his embrace with a soft sigh, covering his large hands with her own, her lips curving into a profound, contented smile. "Are you happy, Marco?" Jane asked softly, her voice carrying over the joyful giggles of the triplets who were now building a magnificent pancake tower at the wooden table. Marco looked at the three beautiful girls who had once been trapped in a terrifying, silent void. And then he looked down at the incredible woman who had bravely pulled them all back into the light. He thought about the millions of dollars he had surrendered, the terrifying reputation he had willingly destroyed, and the violent legacy he had completely erased from his soul. "I have never been richer in my entire life," Marco whispered, his deep voice thick with absolute, undeniable truth. He gently turned Jane around in his arms, looking deeply into her eyes as he slid a simple, elegant diamond ring onto her left hand. It was not bought with dirty blood money or cruel intimidation, but with the quiet, honest promise of a man who had completely rebuilt his life for the woman he cherished. "I promise to choose you, and I promise to choose them every single day for the rest of my life," Marco vowed, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, unbreakable devotion. Jane reached up, her fingers gently tracing the rough line of his jaw as she pulled him down for a deep, passionate kiss that permanently sealed their beautiful, hard-won future. The monster had finally been tamed, not by a greater violence, but by the relentless, unconditional warmth of a woman who refused to let him drown in his own darkness. They had all been terribly broken by the unforgiving world, but together, they had picked up the shattered pieces and forged a magnificent, indestructible family. True wealth is never found in the terrifying empires we build, but in the beautiful, quiet love that stays with us when the shadows finally fade. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end here on Sunni Romance. If Marco and Jane's beautiful journey touched your heart, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video so we can keep bringing you more emotional stories every single day. We would absolutely love to hear from you, so tell us in the comments, do you believe that a person can completely change their life and leave a dark past behind for the sake of true family and love? Share your thoughts below because we read every single one of your wonderful comments. We wish everyone watching this video a beautiful day filled with deep peace, abundant health, and a love that always turns toward the light just like a sunflower. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.